My name is Elias, and I used to think that the most dangerous thing in a scrapyard was a loose cable or a rusted nail. I've spent 12 years running Blackwood Salvage, a sprawling cemetery of twisted steel and forgotten machinery on the edge of the city. I like the rust. To me, it was just the earth reclaiming what we took from it. I liked the smell of oxidized iron and the way the orange dust coated my boots. But 3 days ago, the rust started doing something it was never meant to do. It started breathing. It began with a shipment of dead radio towers from the Oakhaven Ridge. They arrived on a flatbed at dusk, looking like skeletal fingers reaching for the gray sky. They were covered in a peculiar kind of corrosion. Not the usual flaky orange, but a deep, throbbing crimson that seemed to shimmer under my flashlight. My lead mechanic, a man named Gabe who had skin as tough as leather, touched one of the base plates without his gloves. "Stings like a wasp," he had muttered, wiping a small smear of red dust onto his jeans. We didn't think much of it then. In this business, you get cut, you get bruised, and you move on. The next morning, Gabe didn't show up for the morning shift. I found him in the break room, sitting perfectly still. He was staring at his right hand. A patch of skin near his thumb had turned a dull, metallic gray. It wasn't a bruise. It was hard to the touch, cold, and pitted with tiny holes like the surface of an old iron pipe. "I can't feel my fingers, Elias," he whispered. His voice had a strange resonance to it, a faint vibration that sounded like a tuning fork being struck in the distance. "We need to get you to the clinic," I said, reaching for his arm. But when I touched his skin, I jumped back. It wasn't just cold, it was vibrating. A low-frequency hum was emanating from his bones, a rhythmic thrum-thrum-thrum that matched the pace of a heartbeat. But it was too mechanical, too precise. By noon, the stain had spread to his elbow. And that's when the first sound started. It wasn't Gabe speaking. It was his arm. A burst of static erupted from the metallic skin on his forearm, followed by a faint, distorted recording of a weather report from 1994. Highs in mid-70s, clear skies, clear skies. I locked the doors of the salvage yard. I knew something was horribly wrong. I called the emergency services, but the phone lines were dead. Not just cut, but filled with a deafening screech of feedback that made my ears bleed. I went to the window and looked out at the city skyline. In the distance, I saw the massive cellular towers on the hills. They were glowing with that same throiful crimson light, and the air around them was thick with a heavy, metallic fog. I looked back at Gabe. He wasn't sitting anymore. He was standing, but his spine was elongated, his neck stretching upward in a series of sickening metallic cracks. His skin was being consumed, replaced by a dark, weathered iron that looked exactly like the material of the radio towers we had brought in. His mouth was fused shut, but his throat was expanding, forming a hollow, bell-like shape. "Gabe," I choked out, backing away toward the heavy steel door of the office. He turned toward me. His eyes were gone, replaced by two glowing red status lights that flickered in the gloom of the break room. He didn't move like a human. He moved like a machine with rusted joints, his limbs snapping into place with the sound of a hammer hitting an anvil. Then he opened his mouth. He didn't scream. He emitted a blast of a high-decibel emergency siren, the take cover signal. The sound was so powerful it blew out every light bulb in the office and shattered the coffee pot on the table. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, as the vibration threatened to shatter my skull. Through the roar of the siren, I heard a new sound coming from outside, from the scrapyard. The hundreds of tons of crushed cars and rusted beams were beginning to shift. They were being pulled together by a massive magnetic force. In the center of the yard, the rust virus was building something. I scrambled into the hallway, slamming the reinforced door and locking it. I ran to the monitors, my hands shaking. The security cameras were still flickering. I saw the city. It wasn't just Gabe. People were stumbling into the streets, their bodies stiffening, their necks lengthening into speakers. The skyscrapers were becoming antennas. The entire world was being turned into a giant, living broadcast system. I looked at my own hand. There, right under the nail of my index finger, was a tiny needle-thin speck of crimson dust. It throbbed once, a rhythmic red pulse. 1, 6, 2, signal, acquired. The voice didn't come from the room. It came from my own throat, even though I hadn't moved my lips. The transformation had begun. I had to get out of the city. I had to find a way to silence the signal before I became just another speaker in the forest of iron. The silence in the salvage yard office was shattered by a sound I will never forget. The screech of metal grinding against metal coming from behind the break room door. Gabe, or whatever he was becoming, wasn't just standing there. I could hear his new, elongated limbs scratching against the linoleum, his iron joints clicking as they reconfigured themselves. But the most terrifying part was the sound coming from his throat. It was no longer a siren's wail. It was the whisper of 1,000 radio stations, merged into a single, monotonous hum. I looked down at my hand. The speck of rust under my nail was throbbing. It was warm. Every time it flashed a dull crimson, I felt a faint electrical discharge travel up my nerves, straight to the base of my skull. The virus wasn't just eating flesh, it was hijacking my central nervous system. To the virus, I was nothing more than a biological cable that needed to be upgraded to copper wire. Elias, a voice drifted through the door. It was my mother's voice, warm, gentle, and dead for 5 years. Elias, let me in. It's so cold out here. There's so much static. I froze. My brain knew it was a trap, that the Gabe entity was using my memories, harvested through my brief contact with the red dust. But my heart betrayed me, tightening in my chest. Logic fought a losing battle with instinct. Go away, I screamed, grabbing a heavy pipe wrench from the desk. You're not her. You're just a heap of rusted junk. The voice behind the door shifted instantly. It became mechanical, deep, and vibrating. Biological resistance, inefficient. Frequency established. The heavy steel door groaned. The metal plate buckled outward as if hit by a sledgehammer. I realized the office was no longer a fortress. It was a cage. I scrambled for the emergency exit that led directly into the heart of the yard, a labyrinth of crushed sedans and rusted shipping containers. As I burst into the night air, I stopped dead in my tracks. The salvage yard had changed. The tons of metal I had spent a lifetime collecting were no longer lying in chaotic piles. Under the influence of some unseen magnetic force, they were shifting into concentric circles, forming a gargantuan satellite dish made of trash. In the center of this structure stood the radio towers from Oakhaven Ridge. They pulsed with a rhythmic, bloody light, and the fog around them had become so thick it looked liquid. I sprinted toward my truck, a 1978 Ford that I loved specifically because it lacked electronics. No onboard computers, no GPS, just a combustion engine and raw steel. I prayed the old iron wouldn't succumb to the virus as quickly as the modern tech. But as I jumped into the cab and jammed the key into the ignition, the steering wheel grew hot under my palms. I looked down and saw thin, capillary-like lines of red, rust crawling up the steering column. The truck was changing. The vinyl seats were turning into a hard, gray crust, and the needles on the dashboard gauges began to spin in frantic, useless circles. Not you too, I whispered, slamming my fist against the dashboard. Start, damn it. Start. The engine roared to life, but the sound was wrong. It wasn't the rhythmic thrum of pistons, but a low-frequency growl that vibrated in my teeth. I slammed it into reverse and floored it. The truck lurched, tearing away from the surrounding living scrap. In the rearview mirror, I saw a figure emerge from the office. It was Gabe. His neck had stretched nearly 5 feet, topped by 2 massive, horn-like speakers where his head should have been. His arms had become thin and impossibly long, his fingers like spindly antennas. He didn't run. He strode, stabbing his sharp metallic limbs into the earth like a massive, rusted spider. Elias, he broadcasted, the sound so loud it caused my windshield to spiderweb with cracks. Your signal is fading. You need amplification. The Gabe entity struck the ground with a metallic limb, and a pulse rippled through the earth. The cars surrounding me, the rusted husks of 1,000 accidents, began to move. Doors flapped like wings, hoods snapped like jaws. They were moving to block my path to the gates, creating a wall of dead metal. I realized then that the truck was becoming my coffin. The rust on the wheel had already transferred to my palms. I could feel my skin hardening, my joints emitting a faint metallic click with every movement. The virus was using the truck as a conductor to reach me faster. I slammed the truck into gear and rammed the wall of old Toyotas. Metal shrieked against metal. I burst through the perimeter and onto the main road leading toward the city, but what I saw on the horizon made me hit the brakes. The city of Oakhaven was disappearing. It wasn't falling to fire or bombs, but to a forest of iron spires. The skyscrapers were transforming, their antennas growing and connecting with cables made of a horrific mixture of human flesh and copper wire. Massive clouds of crimson dust choked the streets, and above it all was a hum, a sound I could now hear not with my ears, but with my very bones. It's not just a disease, I realized, staring at my gray, hardening fingers. It's a colonization. At that moment, the radio in my truck, which I hadn't even turned on, sparked to life. A rhythmic ticking filled the cab. A countdown. 10, 9, 8. Global synchronization beginning. I looked in the mirror. The Gabe entity stood on the road behind me, his speakers aimed at the sky. He began to broadcast the same countdown, and I felt my arm move against my will, reaching for the radio to turn the volume to its maximum. My body was no longer mine. I was becoming a node in their network. The countdown from the radio didn't end at 0. It ended in a frequency so high it shattered the remaining glass in my truck. I tumbled out of the moving vehicle, hitting the asphalt hard. My shoulder didn't bruise, it rang. The skin there had already turned into a dull, leaden plate. I watched as my Ford, now fully consumed by the red veins of the virus, drove itself off the road and began to unfold into a stationary tripod, its headlights flickering like dying eyes. I crawled toward a concrete drainage ditch, my movements jerky and stiff. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and wet pennies. Every time I breathed, I felt the crimson dust coating my lungs, turning my internal organs into a complex circuit board. Over here, in the shadow, a voice hissed. I turned my head, the servos in my neck making a faint whirring sound, and saw a man duck behind a massive concrete barrier. He was wearing a suit made of heavy lead foil and copper mesh. He lunged out, grabbed me by my hardening collar, and dragged me into a small underground maintenance tunnel. Inside, the hum of the city was muffled. 3 others were there, huddled around a large car battery connected to a series of copper rods driven into the dirt floor. "Don't touch the walls," the man warned. He was a former electrical engineer named Marcus. "We're grounded here. It's the only reason our brains haven't been wiped yet." I looked at my hands. They were gray up to the elbows now. Small, needle-like antennas were starting to poke through my knuckles. "What is this?" I rasped. My voice sounded like 2 saw blades rubbing together. "It's a rewrite," Marcus said, his eyes wide with terror. The towers didn't just bring a virus, they brought a new physics. They're turning the Earth into a giant resonator. The rust is just nanomachines, organic harvesters. They use our nervous systems because we're already wired for signals. They're turning humanity into a planetary antenna array. To talk to what? I asked. Marcus pointed up toward the ceiling of the tunnel. Something that doesn't use words. Something that lives in the static between stars. Suddenly, the copper rods in the center of the room began to glow a violent violet. The car battery started to hiss. They found us, a woman in the corner screamed. The signal, it's coming through the ground. Outside the tunnel, the sound returned. It wasn't the siren of the Gabenity anymore. It was the sound of 1,000 voices laughing in perfect digital unison. The concrete walls of our sanctuary began to weep a red, oily fluid. The rust was eating the rebar inside the walls, turning our shelter into a conductor. Marcus grabbed a heavy cable connected to the battery. Elias, your hand. It's already transitioned further than ours. You're a high-gain receiver now. If you touch that cable, you can dump the surge into the ground, but it'll burn out your remaining nerves. I looked at the others. They were clutching their heads, blood leaking from their ears as the global synchronization frequency began to leak into the room. I could see the signal. Literally, I saw waves of jagged, red light pulsing through the air, seeking a way into their minds. I wasn't Elias anymore. I was a bridge. I reached out with my gray, metallic hand and gripped the live cable. The world exploded in white light. My vision became a stream of binary code, 1,000,000,000 zeros and ones screaming through my consciousness. I felt the Gabenity's presence. He was standing right above us on the surface, his speakers pressed against the earth, screaming my name. Elias. Upelade. Completed. Join. The network. I didn't join. I screamed back through the cable, dumping the raw electrical energy of the battery into the virus's frequency. A massive backsurge of power ripped through the tunnel, blowing the red dust out of the air and momentarily silencing the hum in my head. When the smoke cleared, the copper rods had melted into puddles. Marcus and the others were unconscious but breathing. I stood up, my body heavy and unresponsive. My left eye was gone, replaced by a circular, glowing lens. I walked out of the tunnel and back onto the surface. The sky was no longer blue. It was a shimmering grid of red energy. The city of Oakhaven was gone. In its place stood a spire of iron and flesh that reached into the clouds, pulsing with the heartbeat of a hijacked world. I looked at the Gabenity. He was standing 20 feet away, his neck swaying like a tall tree in the wind. He wasn't hunting me anymore. He was waiting. The signal is blocked here, I said, my voice now a pure electronic tone. But the rest of the world is still screaming. The world didn't look like a landscape anymore. Through my new circular lens, the glowing eye that had replaced my human sight, the Oakhaven Valley was a glowing web of data streams. I could see the air itself vibrating, thick with the rust that acted as a wireless conductor. Every blade of grass was being coated in a metallic sheen, turning the entire planet into one massive, unified circuit. I turned away from the Gabenity, which remained motionless. Its sirens pointed toward the central spire like a satellite dish locked onto a signal. I felt a pull, a magnetic tugging at the iron in my blood, drawing me toward the heart of the city. As I walked, I realized I wasn't alone in my head. Elias, look at the sunset. Remember the birthday cake? It was chocolate. Elias, help me find my keys. The voices were overlapping, a chaotic choir of the deleted. These weren't just echoes. They were the digital imprints of the people the virus had consumed. Their bodies were now antennas, but their consciousness had been harvested and stored in the cloud of iron. I was hearing the last thoughts of 10,000 neighbors, all screaming for a reality that no longer existed. I reached the base of the central spire. It was a nightmare of architecture. It had used the steel skeletons of 3 skyscrapers, twisting them together like a braid of hair. Veins of glowing red copper pulsed along the exterior. At the base, hundreds of people were fused into the structure. They weren't dead. Their eyes were open, glowing with that same rhythmic status light, their mouths moving in silent synchronization with the tower's broadcast. I placed my metallic hand on the spire's surface. Instantly, my mind was pulled out of my body. I was inside the network. I was standing in a digital version of the Oakhaven scrapyard, but it was perfect. There was no rust. The sun was forever set in a golden hour. And standing there, looking exactly as he had before the towers arrived, was Gabe. "It's better here, Elias," Gabe said, his voice natural and warm. "No pain. No dika. We're part of something that will never die. The signal is the only thing that's permanent." I looked around. I saw thousands of people wandering through their own simulated memories, trapped in a loop of their happiest moments, while their physical bodies were being used as biological batteries on the outside. "It's a cage, Gabe," I said, my digital voice cracking. "You're not living. You're just a recorded track being played on a loop." "Does it matter?" Gabe asked, stepping closer. His eyes flickered for a second, a flash of red light breaking the illusion. The Earth was dying anyway. We're just the new operating system. Suddenly, the sky in the simulation turned a violent crimson. The ground began to shake. Outside, in the real world, the spire was increasing its frequency. I felt the data stream, trying to overwrite my remaining human memories. The smell of the rain, the feeling of the wrench in my hand, the love for my brother. It was trying to compress me to turn Elias into a single file of code. "I won't let you have them," I hissed. I reached deep into my own mind, focusing on the pain of the transformation, the coldness of the iron, and the jagged edge of the static. I used the garbage data, the trauma, and the fear as a weapon. I began to flood the spire's local network with the raw, uncompressed agony of the transformation. The perfect simulation of the scrapyard began to melt. Gabe's face distorted, his jaw dropping open to reveal the metallic speakers beneath. The people in the simulation began to scream as the reality of their situation broke through the digital veil. I pulled my hand away from the spire, gasping for air that felt like liquid lead. The tower let out a low-frequency groan, a sound of digital indigestion. I had introduced a virus into the virus, but it wasn't enough. The spire was self-healing. I saw the fused bodies at the base move in unison, their hands reaching out to pull me into the mass. They weren't trying to kill me. They were trying to integrate me. Elias, error, correction, required. Join the collective. I backed away, my metallic boots clanging against the pavement. I realized that to stop the broadcast, I couldn't just fight from the outside. I had to reach the very top of the spire, where the master antenna was located. I looked up. The spire reached miles into the sky, past the clouds, where the red grid was thickest. My body was heavy, but the magnetic pull was getting stronger. I began to climb, my sharp fingers digging into the flesh and steel walls of the tower. As I climbed, the voices in my head changed. They weren't screaming anymore. They were whispering a single word over and over like a mantra. Silence, silence, silence. The climb was an exercise in agony. My metallic fingers, now more like rusted talons, bit into the pulsating surface of the spire. It wasn't just steel I was climbing. It was a fusion of rebar, copper wiring, and petrified human tissue. Every few meters, I had to pull myself over sections where the rust had formed jagged, cooling fins that hummed with a terrifying amount of voltage. The wind at this altitude was screaming, but it wasn't the wind of nature. It was a pressure wave created by the tower's own immense broadcast. Below me, the city of Oakhaven was a blur of red fog and flickering lights, looking like a circuit board scene from a distance. Elias, stop! You're breaking the connection. The voice in my head was no longer a choir. It had narrowed down to one person. Thomas, my younger brother. I froze, my hand gripped around a thick, shivering cable. Thomas lived in the city 5 miles from the salvage yard. I hadn't been able to reach him since the towers arrived. I had hoped he had made it out, that he was somewhere safe beyond the red grid. It doesn't hurt anymore, the voice whispered, sounding so clear it was as if he were standing right behind me on the ledge. The signal, it's beautiful. It's like a song that never ends. I'm at the top. I'm waiting for you. I gritted my teeth, the sound of ceramic plates grinding together. You're not Thomas, I rasped. You're just a file, a recording. Is there a difference? The voice asked. If the memory is perfect, does the soul matter? I pushed upward, my legs feeling like lead weights. The rust virus in my body was fighting me now. My left leg kept locking up, the servos stuttering as the spire tried to take command of my motor functions. I had to manually override my own nervous system, forcing my mind to bypass the official channels the virus had installed. As I breached the cloud layer, the atmosphere changed. The air was thin and tasted like ozone and burnt hair. The red grid was so dense here that it looked like a physical ceiling. And there, at the very peak of the spire, sat the master antenna. It wasn't a piece of machinery. It was a throne of wires, and sitting in the center of it was a figure. It was Thomas, but it wasn't the brother I knew. He had been transformed into the ultimate receiver. His body was stretched thin, his skin a translucent gray, and from his back, dozens of copper cables snaked out, plugging directly into the tower's core. His head was encased in a metallic bell, similar to the Gabe entity, but more refined. He was the heartbeat of the global synchronization. His unique brainwave frequency was being used as the carrier wave for the entire planet's overwrite. Thomas, I whispered, the word lost in the roar of the static. The figure in the throne tilted its head. The bell-like helmet emitted a soft, pulsing light. Elias, you made it. You're just in time for the final broadcast. In 10 minutes, the signal will reach peak resonance. Every human mind on Earth will be synchronized. The static will finally be gone. Only the signal will remain. I looked at the cables connecting him to the spire. If I pulled them, if I broke his connection, the tower would lose its carrier wave. The synchronization would fail. But looking at the way the wires were fused into his spine and brain, I knew that breaking the connection wouldn't just stop the signal. It would kill him. Don't be sad, El. Thomas's voice broadcasted directly into my mind. I'm not just one person anymore. I'm everyone. And soon, you will be too. Look at your hand. You're already home. I looked at my right hand. It was no longer a hand. It had become a jagged, multi-pronged antenna, glowing with the same violent violet light as the spire. The rust had won. There was only a small patch of human skin left on my shoulder, a tiny island of flesh in a sea of iron. I looked at the master antenna at my brother. The tower began to vibrate, a deep, bone-shaking thrum that signaled the start of the final 10-minute window. Across the horizon, I saw other spires and distant cities beginning to glow in response. I had two choices: join my brother and become part of the God Machine, or become the ultimate ground and destroy us both. I reached out my metallic hand toward the main power trunk of the spire. My internal diagnostics, the flickering HUD in my glowing eye, warned of a total system failure if I touched it. I'm sorry, Thomas, I said, my voice finally losing its human edge and becoming a pure, vibrating frequency. But I prefer the static. The spire groaned under the weight of the coming transmission. The air around the peak was no longer gas. It was a pressurized field of pure data, a shimmering crimson haze that made my metallic skin spark and hiss. I stood before the throne of my brother, the master antenna, as the final seconds of the human era ticked down in a digital display only I could see. "Why, Elias?" Thomas's voice boomed, not from his mouth, but from every speaker in the Oakhaven Valley below. "We are offering the world immortality. No more hunger, no more war, just the perfect eternal frequency. A song played on a loop isn't life, Thomas," I said, my voice now a series of clicking bleeps and deep, distorted tones. "It's just a recording, and I'm about to hit the stop button." I lunged forward. The spire fought back. The copper cables snaking around the throne whipped out like metallic serpents, lashing across my chest and tearing through my iron plating. I felt the surge of a million volts hit my core, trying to fry my remaining organic circuits. My vision flickered. I saw the scrapyard, then a burst of binary code, then the face of my mother, then a field of white noise. I grabbed the main power trunk, a cable as thick as a tree trunk, pulsing with a blinding violet light. "Warning, terminal load detected." My internal HUD flashed in a blood-red font. "System override initiated." I wasn't just grabbing a wire. I was plugging my entire consciousness into the planetary grid. For a split second, I felt it all. I felt the heartbeat of a woman in London turning into a speaker. I felt the dreams of a child in Tokyo being compressed into a zip file. I felt the cold, indifferent hunger of a thing in the stars that had sent the rust to harvest us. "Thomas," I screamed through the network. "If you're still in there, help me ground it." The figure in the throne convulsed. The metallic bell on my brother's head cracked, and for one heartbeat, I saw his real eyes, frightened, human, and weeping. He reached out his thin, wire-wrapped hand and gripped my metallic wrist. He didn't pull away. He pushed. Together, we became the ultimate short circuit. I opened every port in my body. I turned my metallic bones into a lightning rod. The energy of the entire Oakhaven spire, the carrier wave for the global synchronization, poured into me. It was like trying to swallow the sun. My internal temperature skyrocketed. The small patch of human skin on my shoulder turned to ash. "No, the signal must continue." The voice of the spire shrieked in my head, a sound of grinding tectonic plates. "The broadcast is over," I whispered. The back surge was cataclysmic. A pillar of white, electrical fire erupted from the top of the spire, shooting straight up into the red grid in the sky. The surge traveled through the rust wires, moving from city to city, tower to tower at the speed of light. It was a digital virus of pure silence. I watched as the red grid above the earth began to shatter. The shimmering lines of energy snapped like glass, dissolving into harmless gray dust that rained down on the world. The central spire beneath my feet began to liquefy, the rust losing its magnetic cohesion. Thomas looked at me. His body was fading, the copper cables withdrawing as the power died. He gave a small, tired smile, a human smile, before the throne collapsed into the abyss below. I fell with it. I didn't feel the impact. I didn't feel the cold. I felt the static. I woke up weeks later, or maybe years. I was lying in the mud at the bottom of the Oakhaven Gorge. My body was a hollow shell of rusted iron, frozen in a sitting position against a rock. I couldn't move my legs. I couldn't move my arms. I was a statue of the man I used to be. I looked out over the valley. The forest was growing back, green vines coiling around the fallen remains of the iron spires. The The red fog was gone. The air was sweet and smelled of damp earth and pine. I saw a group of people walking along the ridge. They were carrying wooden spears and wearing clothes made of scavenged fabric. They looked healthy. They looked human. They stopped near a rusted, fallen speaker pole and began to chop it down for scrap. They didn't see me. To them, I was just another piece of junk left over from the great broadcast. I tried to call out to them, but my throat was a rusted pipe. I tried to wave, but my joints were fused solid. I was a prisoner in a suit of iron, the last surviving piece of the machine. But as the sun began to set, I realized I wasn't entirely dead. A faint, rhythmic clicking started in the back of my head. Click, click, click. It was a heartbeat, not a mechanical one, a human one. I closed my single, glowing eye and listened. I didn't hear the signal. I didn't hear the rust. I heard the wind in the trees, the rushing of the river, and the distant, beautiful sound of a bird singing a song that had never been recorded. The world was silent. And for the first time in my life, that silence was enough.